Hey there, students. Tom Richey here, and broadcasting with the Bill of Rights Institute for a bit of A-Push review. Really excited to have us back tonight, and we are going to focus this evening on constitutional amendments in context. Okay, so this is going to be kind of a broad review. Of course, there's been speculation by some people. We don't really know anything about this by and large, but there could possibly be some kind of approach to the DBQ. Let's say that, some people are speculating that maybe the DBQ will end up being more thematic and will cover a longer period of time than a normal DBQ, but we don't know. Okay. So with that, since this is very interesting. James, I definitely think that there is something to discuss there. Now, of course, I'm not on my channel. I'm on a channel with the Bill of Rights Institute. Now, of course, the Bill of Rights Institute does take strong positions about civil liberties and the like. I think that it is going to be interesting depending on how drawn out this current situation is with the coronavirus, that we definitely are seeing something that is testing the limits of government power. Now, I think the best thing for you to do at this point would be to make sure, if you haven't subscribed already, go ahead and subscribe to the Bill of Rights Institute, maybe the sort of thing that they tackle with one of their bright and early webinars. But yeah, it would be very fascinating to see what happens. Now, one thing, James, that I want to note when you're asking, could we see a constitutional amendment come out of this? One thing that we want to think about, though, is that the Constitution is very, very difficult to amend. Like when we think about the amendment process, it is extremely difficult. Now, I'm going to be referring to a PowerPoint presentation, and I will make sure that that's shared with the Bill of Rights Institute afterwards so that y'all can download this, okay? So we want to think about that, though, when I go into the amendment process. Let me go ahead. There's actually another presentation that you're actually making me think about here. Let's see. So this is going to be focusing on the Constitutional Convention. Now, let's go ahead. And I think, James, you have set us up very well thinking about amending the Constitution. Okay. So when we think about the Constitution as it came out of Philadelphia, the Constitution only had what was originally there without the Bill of Rights. Now, remember that the Bill of Rights, that forms the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution. And so let me go ahead and talk about the amendment process and why I say, James, we may not be very likely to see a formal amendment to the United States Constitution because it's very difficult to do. Now, one thing we might remember about the Articles of Confederation is that the Articles of Confederation required the consent of all 13 states in order to amend. Now, that was one of the major defects of the Articles of Confederation because it made it to where it's just you can't change anything. Think about, if you've got 13 people and you're ordering pizza, is everybody going to agree? You're never going to be able to get 13 people to agree on anything. There's going to be an outlier somewhere. So that's why when you think about the method that the framers came up with for amending the Constitution, that's something that we want to think about. Okay, so first of all, let's go into that process. When we're thinking about amending the Constitution, again, I will make sure those of you watching this later, you should see that this is available in the description of the video. This will be after the broadcast. Any of the presentations that I'm referring to, I'll make sure that those are provided to the Bill of Rights Institute. There will be a link in the video, so just check later if you're watching live. So with that, amending the Constitution, it starts with 2/3 of Congress. And this is where we want to think about like the federal nature of our Constitution. And by federal, now this is something that's really important here because one thing that I see A-Push students get confused about year after year after year is they get confused with the Federalist Party and the idea of federalism. Okay, so the thing is, we want to, and then of course the federal government. Like some people say, isn't the federal government a national government? And it's like, not really. Okay, and this is the thing, that we don't have a unitary government in the United States. We have a federal government. And one thing about that, this is where I would refer to Federalist 39. Okay, Federalist 39 was written by James Madison. And of course, all of the Federalist Papers were aimed at promoting the Constitution, persuading people that the Constitution was not going to be a threat to them. Now, the anti-Federalist writers like Brutus and Cato and some of these people who were coming out there, Federal Farmer, they were saying, hey, this Constitution, it's going to create a national government, and it's not going to create a Republican government. Now, a Republican form of government is a government that is accountable to the people, where the people administering the government understand that they're doing so for the benefit of the people they represent, not for the benefit of themselves. And so Brutus said, like, look, what's going to happen here if you ratify the Constitution, that there are going to be ambitious and designing men who are going to get into these offices, and they're going to use these offices to promote their own interest instead of the public interest. And that would mean that there's not going to be a Republican form of government. Now, Madison in Federalist 39 is he's addressing concerns of people who are saying that, look, this is going to create a national government. It's going to destroy the states. And so what happens here is Madison starts kind of analyzing this. Now, Hamilton would have just been like, nah, no, of course not. You don't have to worry about this. Now, Madison tends to be a little bit more scholarly, a bit more nerdy, a bit more forthright. Like typically, if you're reading a Hamilton Federalist paper, he's pretty much trying to sell you a bill of goods. Madison would get more like a professor, looking into this. And so here's the thing that Madison asks, that like when we think about a national government versus a federal government, for the purposes of ratification is a federal act because the Constitution had to be ratified by 9 out of the 13 states, that 2/3 of the states had to ratify the Constitution. Now, note as well, the other 4 states would only become part of this government when they ratified the Constitution for themselves. So no state was forced to ratify the Constitution. And then when we think about Congress, okay, Madison said, well, is Congress a national or a federal body? Well, in the sense of the House of Representatives works like a national body because the House of Representatives is proportional. Whereas when we think about the Senate is a federal house. So you think about this, that in the House of Representatives today, California makes up over 10% of the US House because over 10% of the United States population lives in California. But in the Senate, there are 2 senators from California and 2 senators from Wyoming. So we see here that Congress is both national and federal. Okay, it's partly national, partly federal. The Electoral College, when we look at the Electoral College, it is federal. Some people are confused about our elections sometimes. And the thing is that we do not have a national election. We have 51 federal elections. Now, that's one constitutional amendment that happened after World War II, so you don't have to be aware of this one for your exam, but just keep that in mind, that there is a constitutional amendment that gave Washington, D.C. electoral votes. So we have 51 federal elections, and the results of those federal elections are all tallied up together, and they are counted. The results of those elections together are counted. Whoever wins that federal election becomes the president of the United States. So remember, we don't have a national election. We have a federal election. The president is the president of the United States, okay? Not the president of the people of the United States. The framers, would be horrified if they saw how much popular campaigning there is for the presidency. Now, what about the powers of this government? Now, one of the biggest things that the Federalists had to persuade people was that the powers of this government would be limited, okay, because the Constitution is creating a federal government. Now, in the operation of the government doesn't need constant okays from the states in order to do its job like it did under the Articles. Now, finally, the amendment process. So the amendment process, Madison has made clear, that is federal. 38 states, regardless of population, which is 3/4 today, is 38 states. So when you think about 38 states, California doesn't get anything extra when it comes to the amendment process. Wyoming is not penalized when it comes to the amendment process. That in order to amend the Constitution, 38 states have to be on board. So you see here that Madison in Federalist 39, when he's asked, is this going to create a national government or a federal government? You can see the case he's making, which Madison would get the complex understanding point on a DDQ or an LEQ, because Madison is saying, look, it's mostly federal, but it does have a few national elements, okay? But we want to note here that the amendment process is a federal process, and while it's not impossible, it's something that's very, very difficult, which is why basically we see today that the Constitution is amended informally by the Supreme Court a lot more than it's amended formally through the amendment process, okay? And so with that, we've got a national government in some respects, but it remains federal in most respects. And so when we look at the amendment process, okay, so when we think about the amendment process, that's in this one. Now, so going here, that we see here that the amendment process is, first of all, Congress, okay, 2/3 of both houses of Congress. So the Senate and the House both have to pass an amendment by 2/3. Now, note here that that does not mean that the amendment becomes part of the Constitution. Congress is basically like this, okay? This is Congress whenever they put an amendment to the states, okay? They go to the states and then the states, they consider it, okay? So Congress proposes amendments, and it's the states that are going to decide whether those amendments become part of the Constitution. And it takes 3/4 of the states in order to amend the Constitution. So the states will ratify or reject amendments. And so, for example, James Madison, the author of the Bill of Rights, actually proposed initially 12 amendments to the Constitution. Now, 10 of those were ratified immediately. One of those was ratified in my lifetime in the early 1990s. The 27th Amendment was one of Madison's original amendments. Now, some amendments have had a sunset clause on them, like the amendment needs to be ratified by this time in order to take effect. But in that case, there was no sunset clause, and so that has become part of the Constitution. So 11 of the 12 amendments that Madison put forward are now part of the Constitution. And what Madison wrote here in Federalist number 43 is that the amendment process guards equally against that extreme facility which would render the Constitution too mutable, make it too easy to amend to where this contract, as Madison saw it, wouldn't mean anything. And in that extreme difficulty, which might perpetuate its discovered faults. So the framers realized that there are people, that there are going to be flaws here. There are going to be things that may not have been flawed at that time, but maybe people want something a little different. So Madison in Federalist 43 is noting that this is important here. Now, one thing to note, this has never happened before, but there is another way to amend the Constitution that has just never been tried. The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall propose amendments, or on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, okay, which in either case shall be valid, okay? So basically, a convention of states can also propose amendments. Now, one thing that we've certainly seen in the state of emergency, and that's where, we could possibly see some kind of constitutional activity, James, is when we think about what are the powers of the president versus the powers of the governors. We think about federalism when there's a national emergency, okay, something like this, that, you had this kind of back and forth between President Trump and Governor Cuomo and some of the other governors in terms of who has the power, who has the authority here in order to get things back working. So can the president say, like, hey, the economy is back up and running, or how much can the governors push back? When we think about, like, quarantining a state, for example. We haven't seen that happen, but does the president have the authority to say, nobody's going to travel into this state? Okay, nobody's going to travel in and out of a certain state. That would be something to do with that. And so with that, the 14th Amendment, now that's going, what's interesting here, the 14th Amendment, to think of that as Madisonian, I don't know about that. That's interesting. It would depend on what you consider Madisonian. James, there's one thing that some people talk about, a James Madison problem, that it's like, Madison tended to adjust to the situation at hand. And so one thing that the 14th Amendment, and we'll get to that later, that the 14th Amendment really did a lot to change the balance of power in the state, between the states and the central government. And so let me just see real quick. One of my friends might be watching. I don't know. Let me just see if he's calling about that, because he's an expert on the Constitution. So I hope he's not calling me because I screwed something up. All right. So with that, going into that, let's wait on the 14th Amendment and let's talk a little bit about the Bill of Rights. Okay, so let's think about the Bill of Rights in context. Now, first of all, when we think about the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist, okay, that they are arguing about whether or not to ratify the Constitution. And the Federalists are saying, hey, we want the constitutions that came out of Philadelphia. The Anti-Federalists say, we're not so crazy about this Constitution, but some of the Anti-Federalists said that if there's a Bill of Rights, we can be okay with it. And so this is the thing, that basically when we think about the context of the Bill of Rights, we're thinking in terms of, that this is something that was necessary to get the Constitution ratified. Okay, so this is necessary to get the Constitution ratified. And that is why those things are there, to protect the states from tyranny from the federal government. Because what's happening here is the Articles. Now, remember, the Articles of Confederation said here, federal government, Congress, you've got the authority to handle foreign relations, war, peace, treaties, Army and Navy, that sort of thing. That's your job. Ambassadors, but the states are going to control everything inside the states. We're giving no economic powers to this government or anything like that. And so with the Constitution, basically your biggest additions are the power to tax, and then also the Commerce Clause, which said that the central government will control interstate commerce, which means commerce between states, but also foreign trade. And so they thought, well, and of course you have the unitary executive, you have the Supreme Court, and a lot of Anti-Federalists were wary. They said, this government looks like it's going to be a tyranny. And, they're going to be dealing with the same thing, having this outside government, just like the British did, that's taxing them without their consent. And so the Bill of Rights is something, if the Articles were over here with the states, and then the Constitution as it came out of Philadelphia is over here, that it goes toward the federal government, the Bill of Rights kind of brings it back, okay? Because of the Bill of Rights, we see the pendulum kind of swinging back toward the states, to where the Constitution was no longer a fundamental departure from the Articles of Confederation, that it was something that added some powers, but it still has something to protect the rights of the people in the states. So understand here that what people are afraid of, what especially Anti-Federalists, is that the Constitution does not have specific thou shalt nots, okay? That there are things that are not allowed for this government to do, rights that are specifically protected. Now, Hamilton wrote in Federalist 84, you don't need a Bill of Rights, but of course we know Hamilton, right? Hamilton was just trying to, it was a last ditch effort to try to keep the states, to keep the states from claiming this power. So with that, now for a push, I would not say necessarily that you need to know every amendment in the Bill of Rights, okay? But what I do want you to take a look at is Just a few highlights. Okay, so when we think about the Bill of Rights, it was intended to protect the rights of the people and the rights of the states from being violated by the federal government. Okay, so that's what they're doing here, to protect the people and protect the states. And so a few of these things here I'm going to note here. Now, note one of the biggest takeaways here is that the original Constitution did not include a Bill of Rights. So these are immediate amendments, and the amendments, I always say amendments are like wolves. They travel in packs. Okay. And so when we think about that they typically will show up in groups, that it's very rare that you have a lone wolf amendment. So when we look at the First Amendment, this is one of the most important parts of the Bill of Rights. And so we see here, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Note here, they're trying to correct the syntax here in PowerPoint, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Okay, so or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people to peaceably assemble, or to petition the government for a redress of grievances. And so what you see here is we have these rights of freedom of expression. Okay, speech, press, religion, assembly, and petition. Now, of course, this is something that's kind of interesting and where you might see some potential court cases come out, okay? Because when we think about freedom of religion and freedom of assembly and also freedom of speech. Now, this is where, for example, when you think about freedom of speech, if somebody wanted to protest the quarantine, said that I think the quarantine measures are too harsh. Now, that person has the right to say, I believe these quarantine measures are too harsh. But what happens when somebody says, hey, we're going to get a flash mob together in this one place here. We're going to try to get as many people as possible, as close together as possible, and we're going to use our freedom of assembly as a protest against these quarantine measures. Now, that's where we get into a legal term. We talk about, like governments, what is called inherent powers. Okay, so we've got in the Constitution, enumerated powers, implied powers. These are things that are listed. These are things that can be understood because of what's listed. And then there are inherent powers. These are powers that a government has because it's a government. So if I were to say, tell you what, I don't like this quarantine. Everybody, let's get together and let's show our, let's champion our constitutional rights with a big assembly of hundreds of people. Now, the police could show up. I mean, I could be arrested. Okay, I could be arrested in terms of that. If you look at Schenck versus the United States, for example, I could be arrested for encouraging people to break the law. If I were to say we're getting a flash mob together and we're going to get together and we're going to protest all together and we're not going to even social distance or anything like that. Now, that's something that, I don't have the freedom to assemble if that assembly is shown to be what Schenck versus the United States calls a clear and present danger. Okay, but I do have the right if I say that, hey, I think that these restrictions are too much. I think that they're more than are necessary. I have that right to speak freely. This idea that just speaking freely poses a threat to nobody. Now, that's another thing. What if a religious group were to say, like, hey, we're having church, like Easter just happened, right? And so what if a church had said, you know what, we're having church. So what about these orders that you can't have large gatherings? We're going to have a large gathering because it says in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, that we have freedom of religion. Well, if you've got a government order that says that people can't assemble in large groups. Now, here's the thing, though, that what if it is a religious group saying that that is part of our religious tradition, that we are getting together for Easter service, we're taking communion, this is part of our religion? That would be a very interesting court case if people are if people decide that because we have seen some conflicts between religious groups and the government over some of these quarantine measures, okay, that there are some churches who have insisted on having services. So that definitely could be something that we could see in terms of case law and civil liberties when you consider that some of these people are gathering, and those gatherings are because of religion. You've got some churches where thousands of people can gather in that church building, some of these mega churches, and do they have a right to do that? So now the thing is as well is that the Bill of Rights originally was to protect people from the federal government intervening in these things. Now, one thing that we want to note, if we think about the Alien and Sedition Acts, these were passed within a decade of the Constitution. And these Alien and Sedition Acts were clearly unconstitutional because they did represent the federal government cracking down on political speech, okay, on speech against the government. So again, like whether it's the quarantine or any other government policy, you have the right to express your opinion. You have the right to assemble and publish according to law, okay? So keep that kind of stuff in mind there. But the point here is that the federal government would not crack down on these things. Now, the Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, of course, we could get in a discussion of where the comma is and all of that kind of stuff, but remember the overall context of the Bill of Rights, okay? The overall context of the Bill of Rights was to keep the federal government from intervening in, from disarming people, so saying that we are going to take away people's right of self-defense. And that's really what you see here as it's been interpreted by the Supreme Court in terms of that the Second Amendment does uphold an individual's right to bear arms in terms of self-defense. Now, of course, at the same time, states can regulate the use of firearms and the ownership of firearms. Now, the extent of that regulation, of course, we look at McDonald versus Chicago, that regulation cannot be obviously designed to keep someone from exercising a constitutional right. And so then we look at the Fourth Amendment, the protection of private property. And this is, of course, to some extent, this is where we get, you look at some of the, of course, this goes into, after World War II, so it's not so much relevant here, but the development of the right to privacy, that essentially that my personal belongings, my personal papers, that I am protected against, now note here, against unreasonable searches and seizures, okay? So that's something that's very important as well. When you note the Bill of Rights, it says here, unreasonable searches and seizures. So does the government have a right to search my house and search through my belongings? Yes, but there has to be a reason. And of course, in our society, that's where you get a warrant. So this is something to protect the individual from this government becoming a tyranny. And then, of course, there is the 10th Amendment. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Now, that's where we get into, this in terms of, this is really the first lines of the Articles of Confederation made it clear that the powers that the states are not handing over remain with the states. There's nothing in the Constitution that explicitly says that the powers that the states are not giving up and delegating to the federal government, that they're keeping those. And so the point of the 10th Amendment was to make clear that the states retain any powers that they have not expressed. Well, now note here, though, I want to note that I almost misspoke. Note here, it does not say expressly delegated. So it's interesting, the language here is not quite as strong as the articles. So instead of not expressly delegated, it says not delegated, okay? And that's where, of course, we can get into that discussion about the implied powers versus enumerated powers. So Madison, was writing this so that the language is not quite as harsh as what's in the Articles. So even with the Bill of Rights, the Constitution does create a stronger central government than what existed under the Articles of Confederation. Okay, so from there, let's go ahead and see what we've got as far as some questions. All right, so as far as this goes, okay, so here's the thing, Addie, now here's where we get into, government power and that sort of thing. That banning large groups is not against the First Amendment if there is a reason for it that doesn't have to do with speech, okay? And this is where some of this stuff may go to court, okay? We may see some court cases as a result of some of these quarantine measures, because certainly not in my lifetime have we seen the government take such like restrictive measures governing freedom of movement, freedom to work. That's another thing, like whether somebody has like a right to, is there, because you think about the Ninth Amendment. Think about this. The Ninth Amendment says that rights not listed in the Bill of Rights, it's not meant to say that those are omitted. So let's think about this. Do I, as an individual, have a right to work? So when you think about now, of course, as a teacher, I don't have a right to work at a public school. That public school closes, whatever. But what if I were a barber? Okay, so like, for example, in my state right now, barbers are not allowed to work. Barbers, hairstylists, lash and nail technicians, they're not allowed to work. And so, in a lot of states right now. So that's one thing that I would think that would be interesting, that you look and see, does somebody have a constitutional right to work? That if I want to work, do I have a right to do that? Now, that's something, but no, the banning large groups is not against the First Amendment if it passes what the courts call strict scrutiny. Okay, so when strict scrutiny is applied and the government says that the reason that we have banned large public gatherings has nothing to do with trying to stifle freedom of speech, then you end up seeing that. Okay, and so that's something that's going to be interesting. I think that definitely will be interesting, and that's the thing. Yeah. So Addie, that's a question here. That yes, you do see things in the Constitution that during a time of war, the government does have further powers. And so, are we at war with a virus? Now, the thing is, that's an interesting kind of thing. So yeah, the Bill of Rights, and of course, we're here broadcasting with the Bill of Rights Institute. So it is interesting here. What I think is, no matter what you're thinking in terms of your opinion, I think what's most important is that we're able to have a civil discourse about this, and people are realizing that, look, people have different views on these things, and it's okay to have discussions. Now, what's not okay is to break the law. That would be something that, or to encourage breaking the law, that would be something that is not okay. So with that, we get into then going into Reconstruction. So the Civil Rights Amendments, the first few ones, do we need? Yeah, so Emily, you don't need to know all the amendments, okay? So here's the thing, like you saw what I just did with the Bill of Rights, that when I went to the Bill of Rights, let's see. Just going to look up my next thing here. Okay, so as far as that goes, when we looked at the Bill of Rights, Emily, what's important to note here is what I did is I looked at the Bill of Rights in general. And then what I did from there, after looking at the Bill of Rights in general, then I had a few illustrative examples. Okay, so we say here, this was the general purpose of the Bill of Rights. So what was the general purpose of the Bill of Rights? To protect the rights of the people and the rights of the states from a potentially tyrannical federal government. That is the purpose of the Bill of Rights. So then, yeah, so for example, like the 11th Amendment, the 12th Amendment, the 11th Amendment, I don't see any reason why the 11th Amendment would come up, okay? The 12th Amendment could be an interesting thing if you, like, for example, the 12th Amendment, let's say if the DDQ is on 1800 to 1820, like let's say that the focus area of the DDQ is the Jeffersonians. the 12th Amendment could kind of go into that when you think about the disputed elections and all of that. So that's their hand. Yeah, so that's something. Rachel, I think that my friend Hip Hughes has an amazing video where we're thinking, we're thinking about, so hand motions to remember all the amendments. But one thing to note is this is not a government class, okay? That when it comes down to it, as long as you're able to understand the general context of the Bill of Rights. Hey, you want to say hello?
Hi.
Okay, so Caroline wants to say hello. How many amendments are there in the Bill of Rights? What? You don't know yet?
No.
10. It's the first 10 amendments of the Constitution.
Yeah.
Oh, that. Okay, that Bill of Rights. Okay,
Yeah,
there she has exposed my fake wood background there. Thank you, Caroline. It's okay. All right, so yeah, the 11th Amendment, the 12th Amendment, not so much. Okay, so then we go on to the Reconstruction Amendments. Okay, so the Reconstruction Amendments, we have another context for that. Okay, so last time we were talking about the causes of the Civil War. Now let's talk about the effects of the Civil War. So when we think about this, like the three most common explanations of the Civil War are that you've got slavery, you've got the states, the powers of the states versus the power of the federal government, and the different sectional economies in the North and the South. And so when you look at the results of the Civil War, all three of those issues are resolved. Now, maybe some more than others, but definitely like slavery, gone, right? Then you look at the states and federal power. Now, here's the thing, that before the Civil War, it was very, and in any federal government it can be difficult, but it was very difficult before the Civil War to think about what are the powers that the states have, what are the powers that the central government has. And so the amendments in Reconstruction solved some of these issues. Okay, so let's go ahead. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Okay, that these amendments all came during Reconstruction after the Civil War. Okay, so when we look at the 13th Amendment, it abolished slavery. Okay, so one of the things that was causing a lot of trouble in the nation was slavery. And so what's going to happen here? Now, slavery is inherently incompatible with republicanism. And so we see here that immediately after the Civil War, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist in the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Now, one thing that I like to note about the 13th Amendment, the specific context of the 13th Amendment is presidential Reconstruction. So when we look at the 13th Amendment as part of presidential Reconstruction, that Lincoln basically wanted to restore the Union and he wanted to abolish slavery. Now, Lincoln was not he was not a radical. I mean, Lincoln was somebody that when you look at his politics, Lincoln's politics, I would say, were moderate to conservative, really, like generally. Okay, so Lincoln was not one of those people who was like, hey, let's do everything at once. Let's abolish slavery and make sure that African Americans in the South have political equality and the right to vote and run for office. Lincoln thought, look, let's abolish slavery. Let's see what happens. Let's give it some time. Lincoln believed in incremental change. And so abolishing slavery, note here that when we look at the 13th Amendment, I always ask students every year, what did the 13th Amendment do? And they say it abolished slavery. And then, just as far as it abolished slavery, and then what else did the 13th Amendment do? Awkward pause. Some of them will try to guess something. Okay, so when they say, did it make freedmen citizens? No. Did it give freedmen the right to vote? No. So it's like, okay, well, what did this do? All right. And so what else did it do? And finally, I tell them, what else did the 13th Amendment do besides abolish slavery? Nothing. Okay. So nothing. So with that, going into that, thinking about the the 13th Amendment, that this is presidential Reconstruction. It left a lot of questions unanswered about what is the status of these newly freed slaves. So, because remember that Dred Scott, now this is another bit of context, is that the Dred Scott decision, it ruled, the Supreme Court ruled that people of African descent could not be citizens of the United States. And so that was the law of the land at the time. And so with this, the 13th Amendment basically abolishes slavery, but creates this class of people that is somewhere between slavery and citizenship, basically people who live here but do not have the rights of citizens. So the 14th Amendment has this context that several, now not all, but several former Confederate states passed what were called black codes, which restricted the rights of Black Americans living in some of these former Confederate states. Some didn't have black codes. For example, like Georgia never had a black code, but several southern states did. The Mississippi black code is often, is very easy to find online. And so with that, when we see that once radical Reconstruction begins, okay, so once we start to see radical Reconstruction, we see here that the goals of the radical Republicans went beyond Lincoln. Lincoln was more of a moderate, his people were more in the moderate to conservative faction of the Republican Party. And we see here the radical Republicans have come in, and the 14th Amendment is very long, okay? Now, the first part of the 14th Amendment still applies for the most part, okay? But, you don't really hear about the other parts too much, but we'll go into context. The 14th Amendment had on the agenda basically to ensure that Black Americans, no matter where they live, were given citizenship rights, that they are citizens of the United States. So all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. So basically, if you are born in the United States, then you are a citizen of that state. No state shall. Now note here, this is what's interesting here when we think about the Bill of Rights, and then we think about the 14th Amendment, which, James, in response to your question, I would say that the 14th Amendment probably, now, if you look at like Madison in Federalist 10, then maybe it does do something about that because it's making the United States more of a large republic. But I don't, and of course, Madison sometimes was friendly to constitutional amendments. But as far as the original Constitution, which placed the states on a very high level, to the point where several states decided, you know what, we've even got the right to leave if we want. Then, nobody can stop us. Now, people don't really talk about that seriously today, right? So no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. Now, privileges or immunities, when I read this, I'm thinking like, for example, a privilege of citizenship would be something like the right to bear arms. I'm an American citizen, and therefore I have the right to bear arms. Immunities of citizens. As a citizen of the United States, I'm protected from, I am immune to cruel and unusual punishments. So privileges or immunities, it is specific, it is, I believe that it was intentionally vague, but no state shall make or enforce any law which will abridge the privileges or immunities, nor shall any state. So you see here, no state shall, nor shall any state, okay? So this is really kind of the anti-Bill of Rights in a way. So you see here that like, here is the Articles of Confederation, here's the original Constitution, there's the Bill of Rights, here's the 14th Amendment, okay? The 14th Amendment puts the federal government for the first time in a position where the federal government is guaranteeing civil rights, okay? The federal government is guaranteeing that people are being treated equally no matter what state they live in. So nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That's the due process clause, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Now, Brown v. Board is not going to be on this exam. Plessy v. Ferguson could be fair game. But this whole idea of the equal protection clause, remember Plessy v. Ferguson put out there the doctrine of separate but equal, okay, that it doesn't have to be the same in order to be equal. So for example, if I've got a medium pepperoni pizza and you've got a medium pepperoni pizza, we don't have to share a pizza in order for that to be equal. That's Plessy versus Ferguson. Brown v. Board, 1954, said that separate is inherently unequal. And that's the thing when you look at most of the schools at the time, that if there was, was a segregated black school, it was typically not given the same resources and funding as segregated white schools. And so from there, we see here that the only thing you really need to understand is the general principle here of the rest of it. It's essentially, the rest of it is to punish former Confederates, okay? That essentially a former Confederate can't hold office unless Congress says that they can hold office. That then a person can't be disqualified from voting unless they have committed a crime or they have participated in a rebellion. So if somebody has participated in a rebellion, they can be barred from voting, or if they've committed a crime. That's why when you see in the United States, different states have different laws regarding voting, okay? So we see that in some states, people, like every state has a different law about whether convicted felons can vote. Some states, you'll see that, felons can vote from jail, whereas other states, they can't vote while they're in prison. Other states, they can't vote while they're still on parole. And there are some states where if you've been convicted of a violent crime, you just can't vote. And so that's something that when we look here, that basically somebody can be denied office holding because of that. Now, then it says here that the validity of the public debt of the United States, that will not be questioned, okay? But neither shall the United States nor any state assume or pay any debt on the obligation incurred in aid of insurrection or rebellion against the United States. So what we see here is they're saying that the Confederate debt, like any state that made, anyone who made any kind of loan to the Confederacy or a state's Confederate government, they're not getting that money. Now, if somebody made a loan to the Union, they're going to get their money. Okay. So basically, if you supported the Union with money, you're going to get that money back. If you supported the Confederacy with money, you're not going to get that money back. And so that's something there. Now, one thing to note here is the 14th Amendment, it did give citizenship to African Americans, but it did not explicitly confer voting rights. Now, part of this is because there was some resistance in northern states for voting rights. But then we see here, finally, the 15th Amendment was passed, and it said the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Now, note here, race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Now, this is basically saying that a state can't say you can't vote because you're black, or you can't vote because you're brown, or you can't vote because you used to be a slave. Okay, none of this stuff can be said. Now, what we see during the Jim Crow era is we see literacy tests, grandfather clauses, some things like this that we see that, okay, the poll tax. So, oh, well, you didn't pay your poll tax. Do you have your poll tax receipt? Nope. All right, well, you can't vote. That doesn't violate technically the 15th Amendment. Now, there's an amendment later after World War II that during the Civil Rights era that bans poll taxes. You didn't pass a literacy test, can't vote. You committed a crime, you can't vote. But you can't say you can't vote because of your race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So states do find a way for some time during the Jim Crow era to get around this. Now, note here that we don't see another amendment. This is 1870. We don't see another amendment until 1913, the income tax. So that's where we see that the Bill of Rights the first 10 amendments. Then you've got a couple of lone wolves, okay, the 11th and 12th Amendments that kind of clarify some things that they just realized, okay, that didn't work. Like the 12th Amendment is probably the closest the Constitution comes to recognizing the reality of the two-party system. Because originally it was like the person who gets the most votes is the president, person who gets the second most votes is vice president. Well, with the party system, that didn't work out too well. When John Adams in 1796 was elected president, and Thomas Jefferson, his rival, was elected vice president. That didn't work out too well. And then, of course, when Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr tied, because all of the electors voted for them, wrote both their names down, and there wasn't a distinction between the presidential election and the vice presidential election. So that's one thing that's done with the 12th Amendment, that basically, because of the elections of 1796 and 1800, which note, these were the first two contested elections, that before that, George Washington was unanimously elected, you see? So that's something that we see in terms of, okay, that's something that these are the first two contested elections, and there was a problem with both of them. The 12th Amendment addresses how to solve those problems. And so going from there, then you don't have another amendment. The 12th Amendment was ratified in 1804 during Jefferson's presidency. Constitution's not amended again for another 61 years. And so we see here that that we have another 53 years before there is another constitutional amendment. And I have a video on YouTube about the Progressive Era amendments, which is the other wave of amendments. We've got the 16th through 19th amendments. Okay, so let me just go into this. And if you want a more thorough exposition, you can note that that is going to be online. Of course, wait, that's not the one that I meant to open. All right, so let's see, progressive amendments. All right. So going from there, okay, and as I said here, amendments are like wolves, they travel in packs. So we see the Bill of Rights, Reconstruction, and Progressive. These are the three packs of amendments that we can see here. Now, Reconstruction, the Civil War had just happened, and let's clarify what a citizen is. Let's clarify how the powers of the states and the central government, because that's one of the reasons the Civil War was fought in the first place. And then let's go into, so we see there that those issues are solved. And then we've got 4 amendments in 7 years. Okay, so you've got 10 amendments in 2 years. We've got 3 amendments in 5 years, and then we've got 4 amendments in 7 years, okay? And so essentially what happens here is the country has changed a lot. The progressives are now in charge, and they don't really think that this Jeffersonian limited government is really going to work. Now, one video that I would recommend as well is that I've got something here, and this is on YouTube as well. Thomas Jefferson versus Teddy Roosevelt, which I kind of generically call, now I don't want to put the founding fathers in one box, but founders versus progressives. If we think about basically the Jeffersonian mindset, that is not the mindset of Teddy Roosevelt, whereas Jefferson viewed government as something separate from the people. The first time he ever saw the Constitution, that's another video I did a while back, Jefferson and the Constitution, not love at first sight. That Jefferson said, I'm not a friend of a very energetic government. It is always oppressive. Now, Teddy Roosevelt said, we get in the habit of speaking of the government as if it were something apart from us. And he says here, the government is us. We are the government, you and I. And so Jefferson, when you look at the context of the Bill of Rights, that at the turn of the 19th century, pre-industrial, 94% rural. Whereas by the time Teddy Roosevelt's president, 100 years later, at the turn of the 20th century, the United States is heavily industrialized. The United States is 40% urban. So almost as many Americans live in cities as live in rural areas. And so conventional wisdom was that you need a more active government. And so now you see in our traditions, which one thing, and again, you're welcome to take a look at that video, is Ronald Reagan, who was president in 1980. So as far as that goes, when you look at Reagan, he says the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Now, Reagan is, of course, Reagan is, of course, siding more with the Jeffersonian view of what's going on there. So going from there, ladies and gentlemen, we'll now kind of look and take a look here and see what are these amendments. Now, I wrote here what the progressives, if they could rewrite the preamble, what they would have likely done. Okay, if the progressive amendments had a preamble, we, the progressives of the United States, in order to form a stronger central government, organize society based on scientific principles, regulate business, promote moral improvement, and secure the blessings of democracy to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish these amendments to the Constitution of the United States of America. And so we see there the goals of the progressives: scientific principles, moral improvement, regulation of business, and political democracy. And so then we see here the federal income tax, direct election of senators, prohibition of alcohol, and women's suffrage. And when we think about this, that all of these things, I like putting these in the context of the progressives, of their goals. So if you think about the income tax, this is something that is regulating business. Okay, this is something that is also making tax collection more efficient. So when you think about scientific principles, now political democracy, direct election of senators. Now, the direct election of senators is something that's somewhat controversial, and it's something that is somewhat controversial in some circles. People debate whether it actually has made the Senate more accountable to the people, or if we've gone from, the Senate being accountable to elites in the states to national elites. Who knows? But it's an interesting discussion, but it's certainly more democratic. Okay, it's more democratic in the sense that people directly elect their senators. The 19th Amendment, women's suffrage. Now, that was the unfinished business of the Reconstruction Amendments. Women weren't addressed there. And so finally, women get to vote. And also, there are a lot of people who made the argument that women voting could actually lead to moral improvement. The 18th Amendment, when we think about alcohol is bad for you. Alcohol makes people do things that are immoral. And also, it's a regulation of business, what can and cannot be bought and sold. So now note here also that the 18th Amendment is the only amendment that to the Constitution that has been repealed by another amendment. Okay, but then the 19th Amendment, remember Abigail Adams wrote back in 1776 to her husband, remember the ladies. Now, one thing that I want to note here is when we think about what's going on here on the trend, okay, that by the time the 19th Amendment passed, there were several states that had already instituted women's suffrage, and they started with the West. And the pioneering experience is given a lot of credence in the explanation for that. The more traditional East, where you had understandings of women from earlier times, tended to predominate. Now, when you see here that women's suffrage prior to 1920, most states west of the Mississippi allowed for women's suffrage. And so you see here now, of course, it's a similar trend when you look at marijuana laws in the United States, for example. Those definitely seem to have a west to east, but then also kind of northeast as well. So it's interesting the regional impact of some of these movements. So going from there, let me take a few questions here. Now, the 20th and 21st Amendments. Okay, so James, as far as that, now the 13th Amendment, why did it take so long to be ratified? The 13th Amendment took several months to be ratified, but it was from January to December. I don't think that was necessarily like something that, okay, so it did take longer than others. Now, the movie Lincoln, while you're watching things while you're on quarantine, I would recommend the movie Lincoln. That it's really interesting, Emily, that you can see when you watch this movie. It's about Lincoln's fight to ratify the 13th Amendment, to get it through Congress. It was not a foregone conclusion. Like, this is something that there was a great deal of debate about abolishing slavery, because remember, Lincoln The Emancipation Proclamation wasn't so much striking a blow at slavery, the way he had it written as a necessary war measure. It wasn't so much a striking a blow at slavery as striking a blow at the Confederacy's capacity to make war. And so the 13th Amendment, it was still quite a debate in terms of is this are we trying to just abolish slavery outright as a result of the Civil War? So good to note there. Yeah, it was definitely not a foregone conclusion. Now, the 20th Amendment is the lame duck amendment, which I'm not thinking that that's going to become a thing, because now that has to do with the transition from Hoover to Roosevelt. Now, again, somebody could tell, I could end up being wrong. That's why I don't like to predict stuff, but I am not predicting that we're going to see the Depression or World War II on the DBQ. And the reason that I predict that is because a lot of classes did not get that far. A substantial number of classes did not get that far before schools were closed. And so I think that the College Board is going to try to make an effort to be fair. But yes, definitely, Addie, great. Yes, of course. Yes, don't do drugs, kids. Yeah, when we're talking about policy and drug policy, thank y'all for making clear, don't do drugs, kids. That is definitely something that is a good message always to put out there. And I want to make sure we need to always have that message out there. Great closing message. Now, as far as next week, we've got 2 more episodes of our prep webinars. Then we're going to take a week off before going into our nightly webinars that are going to be reviewing for this exam. Okay, so next week, I'm going to look on Tuesday at 6:30 at the history of American warfare. And then on Thursday, we're going to look at immigration and internal migrations. Okay, so as far as that goes, those are the things that we're going to be focusing on next week as we wrap up our Bill of Rights Institute AP Prep webinars. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, remember, if you haven't subscribed already, go ahead and press that button to subscribe to the Bill of Rights Institute so that you'll be notified when I'm going live for a push review. That's going to help you out a lot. May want to make sure your notifications are on. And remember to follow at BRI Students on Instagram. And you're, of course, welcome to follow me at Tom Richey. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, again, thank you so much for coming, and it's always a pleasure.